I can
confirm when we're live.
Thank you.
We're started.
Thank you. Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the Education Advisory Panel being held remotely as an informal briefing this morning. This informal briefing of the Education Advisory Panel is being webcast on the YouTube channel via the County Council's website. I would like to welcome all members, in particular the new members of the panel and of the County Council. So I just move directly on to item 1, which is apologies for absence. I haven't received any apologies. Have you received any?
I haven't received any, Chairman.
Thank you. Okay, item 2 is the minutes of the last meeting. Now we can't formally agree these minutes as this is a briefing today, but I would just like us to receive those minutes and acknowledge them this morning. And I take it everyone that was at that meeting has read those minutes and are happy, but we will formally receive those at our next meeting, which will hopefully be in person rather than remotely. Does anyone have any questions on those minutes quickly before? I'm mindful that the next meeting isn't for a while and we could forget anything. No, it's perfect, thank you. That moves me nicely on to agenda item 3, which is an update on the COVID-19 and education recovery. And this is going to be presented by Brian, Eric, David and Karen. So Brian, I shall hand over to you.
I'm going to pass on straight to the county managers to lead on this. They've prepared a few slides to talk you through, but are very happy to engage in the discussion.
I'm hoping with a bit of whizzing and stirring that actually, there we go. Can people see that first slide showing now?
Yes.
Yes, Eric.
Great, okay. Myself, Karen Nye and David Hardcastle, with our respective responsibilities for early years primary, for vulnerable children and those children in special education and resource provision in education centres, and for secondary education and post-16. We're going to do a bit of a joint act here. So I'm going to kick us off by talking generally and then about the specific responses that we've seen from a whole variety of stakeholders in response to the COVID-19, and I think that the reality is that what we would want to say is, for school leaders, and obviously there are school leaders in the room here, that is a lived experience through leading schools. For us, it's a vicarious one. So what I am and we will be talking to you is our perspective on what leaders are sharing with us and what we're witnessing with our own our own eyes when we are in schools, but they're different lenses. So I'm sure leaders in the meeting today will be able to draw upon their experiences as we go through. Okay, so the first point I think we'd want to make is that there is a question of perspective, and the perspective is informed by experiences. And in a system with over 500 schools, in a widely varying size, community, setting, and having an enormous number of quite unique children and families, it's really difficult to talk about how the COVID-19 has affected each and every one of them, because the reality is that it's hugely variable. And for every case study I could give of a particular impact on one setting or a family or a class or a community or a set of professionals, there would be almost a complete and opposite reaction elsewhere. We still have schools, primary schools for instance, who have not yet had a single case that has affected them directly in terms of bubble closure. And so the other part I think we'd want to make is that the evidence of what is happening is really light at the moment. A lot of the early evidence that was quoted about the effects of a pandemic actually come from previous pandemics, and they come from other disasters such as the earthquake in Christchurch and so on. So whilst there is evidence of the long-term impact of crisis events, of course there can be no long-term impact study of something that's only just happened. But I think from our point of view, we try to bear in mind in our conversations and work, improvement work, that there are those multiple lenses. In other words, the experience of children and their families, of educators in the broadest sense, whether that be a particular staff group or our own school improvement service, for example, and the policymakers who are attempting to navigate through by making national rules to try to fit to local context. But there will be multiple truths, and therefore we could get into a row about what is most true or least true. So in some ways I can only present some generalizations, but I think the principle that drives us to is a really important one, which is the response that any individual child or young person needs will be the one they need, and it has to be evaluated and responded to in the moment and on the basis of a best assessment and evaluation of their circumstances, and that will continue to be true. So it is the response that's required is adaptability, sensitivity, and being really vigilant. Some of the evidence base would suggest that it's 4 months after an event, and an event could be a bereavement in a child's life. It could be a situation of high stress and anxiety. So if there have been some traumatic events for young people and the staff, and certainly the staff in education settings have had to shoulder a lot, actually it's down the line that some of that will start to work out into behaviours and emotional responses and so on. So if I just look at younger children, it's really interesting with young children because it is in the nature of young children to take things pretty much at face value. So as children get older, and my colleagues will talk to that, I think it's slightly different. Memory starts to kick in and learned behaviours and memories attached to it. But for younger children, and remember for children, for instance, in Key Stage 1, which is the first 3 years, with early years, the first 3 years of children's experience if they're in an infant school, of course, 2 of those years have been in COVID, so they don't know any different. They won't have a sense of loss or longing or yearning for something that they've not been doing. They've just been having this experience. And like most children, if educators, and you know, I've no evidence this hasn't been the case, have been making it a positive experience for them, then they have still been enjoying learning and they have been embracing the experiences that have been put in front of them. So I think there's a danger in catastrophizing this as if the experiences will always be negative one because they're not like they were. But for younger children, they are just their experiences, and if they've been of high quality, they may have been different. But that isn't necessarily a completely negative thing. So the impact on children, and I think this is generally true, but particularly in the younger age group, is variable because it's dependent on the circumstances of the family, whether the family were coping in periods of isolation and lockdown with learning at home. We've had families who've reported it's transformed their relationship with their children. We've had young people who've come back into primary education with much better handwriting than they left with, because that was one area that parents could do really well. And of course, for some children, as I alluded to further, there's a kind of luck element. You may only have been home during lockdowns, For other children, they've also been at home during bubble closures, so attendance has varied enormously, and the experience during that periods of attendance has not been entirely at school. Or if you've been in a year group, for instance, such as Year R, where your attendance was prioritised from the start, compared to year 2 where it wasn't, and so on, and again, Year 6 being prioritised, but not Year 3 and Year 4 and Year 5. So there is a randomness to it. But what we can say is it may have affected the coverage of the curriculum. And to make that point simply but clearly, it is the expectation that the national curriculum, so the knowledge, skills and understanding that are in each subject domain area, are areas which children not only experience but they acquire. Now, of course, if they've acquired those at home rather than at school, if they've had periods where they've not been able to engage very much, then there is a possibility of gaps, and that's why the responsiveness of educators is really important. The prime job of an educator is to evaluate and assess, as children are embracing the next part of the curriculum, what it is that they've missed, and make sure that we don't leave gaps behind. Similarly, in terms of social and emotional development, that there are some experiences that children will not have had that other cohorts will have had. They've been more distant from each other. And now that distance could be that they haven't, for instance, in a primary school setting, they've only played with children in their own year group, or perhaps they've only interacted with children within, might be a 2 or 3 class cohort. They've only actually been in contact with a smaller group of children, such as in their particular class. And equally, in terms of resilience, children will often have embraced what's happening rather than necessarily suffering it. So some children have actually become more independent and more self-resilient. So if I give an example of an activity, again, we were really quite concerned last summer about the lack of transition experience. In other words, traditionally, very young children come with their parents and spend quite a lot of time getting used to the reception year environment. There's home visits, there's visits, and very little of that was able to happen last summer. Actually, the evidence that we have picked up is that they didn't have any impact in particular broadly across the piece. There was no negative impact of that. Children didn't come into school not knowing what to do, because the replacement that was put in with video walkarounds that could be viewed over and over again by parents and children at home, for example, as a strategy, actually meant that children were more familiar than they would have been on a single or a couple of visits surrounded by other children, because they had an trusted adult in the family to interact with them and talk through it. So again, I think that just gives a little example of how it may have been different, but it isn't necessarily worse as a result of it, because it's not the same as it's been before. And so far as we can see the impact on standards, it's really, really difficult to evaluate that. There is one study, pretty small scale, which might indicate from a very small sample that there's perhaps been 2 to 3 months of loss of progress. In other words, if you take a cohort of children and say, how might children of their age range done previously in primary, then there's some evidence that they might be 2 months further back than we might expect them to be. So that's 8 weeks of teaching in reading and writing, and maybe as much as 3 months in mathematics. Now the reality is that is not in any way some kind of chasm. I don't think any educator would feel that that gap is something that can't be closed through essentially high quality teaching for the vast majority, if it's because the curriculum is not linear, it overlaps, it returns. So therefore there are opportunities to teach the things. It's not as if in primary we teach something, we never mention it again. So the personal impact, however, for some children, I know Karen will talk a bit more about the more vulnerable children, could be larger than that, and is likely to be for some, but generally perhaps not as tricky. So the professional challenge in terms of responding to COVID is about continuing to assess, not just in a single test to get a mark to work out some kind of false end of year standard, but to continue to assess how children respond to the curriculum in order to spot where the gaps, hesitancies are, and work on them in that moment, or decide whether some additional work would be important, and either draw upon the strengths that children have, or work on any important areas where children perhaps have not socialized enough or have not resolved disputes in the playground enough. These are all educational experiences. And then I think the critical bit there is time. I think the thing that would bother me is if people felt they had to get something done by the end of the summer or done by next autumn. Actually, education is a long game. And so long as we continue to work towards what we know will be the end standards, if there are deficits or gaps, then they're more likely to be robustly dealt with by continuing to be alert to them over time than trying to tackle something over speedily. So lastly, I think it's best for us to think in terms of primary, and my colleagues might pick up on this in terms of other key stages, about opportunities and risks. So one of the opportunities is, actually, it has reminded everybody that education is more than just reading, writing and maths. Actually, the loss of other learning opportunities for physical education, for social and emotional education, and so on, in terms of those experiences in school that are not just lessons. I think it's reinforced the importance of those things. I think also there's an opportunity for us to reconsider keeping children together more in terms of their curriculum journey, rather than allowing gaps and differences to appear between children, working hard to make sure that all children have a sufficient grasp of the core curriculum in every subject and in those aspects that are not subjects. And I think we're already on a journey as a profession to having much more sharper diagnostic teaching. In other words, not just teaching content, but being really alert to the way the content was being responded to, acquired. Ofsted used the word memorized, but embedded into children so that they can draw upon it. In some cases, again, the relationships that have been formed between professionals and families through the remote contacts that they've had have actually strengthened in some regards. There's been more communication perhaps than there might otherwise have been, and certainly the remote pedagogy, in other words, learning, utilizing not just face-to-face, but other interactive forms of teaching which embrace technologies, I think is a really important thing. In terms of the risks, I think there are some, particularly for our youngest children, there are some steps you can't skip. So children need to play in order to develop their full range of skills that will underpin their more formal curriculum. So actually making sure those continue through infant education, where they've been missed. You can't just abandon them and think, well, we can get away without doing those. I think there's a risk of schools panicking, under scrutiny, worrying about Ofsted inspection and so on, and skimming through the curriculum in order to give the appearance of catching up. I think there's a danger that we'll overload children with one-to-ones to try and catch them up quickly. There'll be too much time invested, and if some children may find themselves in a one-to-one extra class for this and an extra class for that and an extra class for that, and look around and go, well, what am I missing while I'm in these one-to-ones? Or why is my school day an hour and a half longer than everybody else's? I think it's high quality teaching that is likely to mostly deal with this, and I think the other bother is a risk that receiving schools at a point of transition may believe that the children are definitely way behind and therefore pitch a little conservatively, rather than keep the pitch of expectations where they're used to and work on catching children up. And again, the remote pedagogy, as we learned before, there are downsides to that in addition to the positives. So a range of different perspectives there. I'll hand over to Karen.
Thank you, Eric. Shall I take control or will you do the slides for me?
Either. I'm happy to move.
Oh, you do them for me. Thank you. Okay, morning, everyone. Building on from what Eric has said, really, the vulnerable children and young people agenda, which, as you know, is my remit in particular. We've also seen real variability, I think, in terms of response of children and young people and their readiness to return to what we can describe as normal for the moment anyway, schooling. And so it's a similar situation to that which Eric has already described. We've had some vulnerable children and young people who we wouldn't know anything had happened, anything was different for them. And others that have had some quite difficult times during lockdown. So when we talk about vulnerable groups, I'm talking about those youngsters with special educational needs, youngsters from economically disadvantaged backgrounds, youngsters open to social care, and so on. And so there is real variability. One of the positives for this group was that they remained in school, many of them, throughout the lockdown period. And in Hampshire, we did incredibly well. Our school leaders managed to secure in the region of 60% of children and young people who were considered in a vulnerable group, still in attendance in school throughout the lockdown periods. And so actually, for those youngsters, learning continued. There were some adjustments, but actually, for that 60%, learning continued, and many of them were in smaller groups and actually really benefited from some additional interventions and just being in that smaller situation with less peers and more adult ratios, higher adult ratios. So that was a real advantage for some children. So again, quite an inconsistency and variability. For those youngsters who were at home, again, some have bounced back into school and seemingly at the moment no real negative impact on them. But nevertheless, there were some concerns. We know that this particular group would have more of an impact, a disproportionate impact, negatively so, on their learning. And so, you know, the schools that we're talking to, very aware of that, really keen to prioritise those youngsters and make sure they're getting to grips with their needs, any gaps that they're finding. So a really strong positive response from schools in terms of our most vulnerable children and making sure that they're prioritised. Behaviour for learning has necessarily been a focus. So, you know, if you haven't been used to being in school for some time, and you've got out of some of those habits, those good habits around learning, that takes a while to get back into the swing of that. And so for some children, there's been more of an emphasis on the sorts of behaviours that we expect in school and the sorts of behaviours that you bring to your learning in order to get the most out of it. And Eric's touched on this actually, particularly for some of our younger children who, you know, they're in the formative stages of understanding how to socialise, to play with other children. The verbal interactions are really important. And for some of those children, they've not had that to any great extent at home. And so just getting back into, how you share your toys, how you share resources in school, and having those interactions is something which some schools are reporting they've needed to focus on. Thanks, Eric. In terms of our specialist provisions, the special schools across Hampshire have done just a superb job throughout lockdown in terms of both looking after their children and young people, but also doing some really extensive work with families to alleviate anxiety around COVID. Some of the special schools have youngsters with significant medical needs, complex needs, and the school staff have worked incredibly well to alleviate anxieties with parents, give them the reassurance that their children are safe, and where necessary, they've put in some really extensive programs to meet those youngsters' education, health and care plans, both at home and at school. I think the vaccination program really helped in that we worked with health colleagues as part of the No Waste programme in Hampshire, so that where there were spare vaccines early on, we were able to prioritise those vaccines for staff in special schools and specialist settings. And I think that gave increased confidence in those communities, and particularly with those parents, that their children were not wholly protected, but they felt that they were safer in those environments with those staff. We have seen higher rates and higher levels of complexity, really, in terms of referrals to our education centres, so the pupil referral units. And that's particularly the case for children with anxiety and for those with emotionally based school avoidance. So we have a set number of places in our education centres for children with significant emotional needs, and the demand for those places has been quite high. We can't say absolutely whether that is, a direct correlation with COVID and lockdown, but certainly we're seeing quite high rates of referral for the PRUs. I think, as I've said, there's been variability in terms of how well children have returned. I would say that in our SEMH provisions, so the provisions that deal with children who have social, emotional, mental health needs, that they are certainly finding more challenges, and children in those provisions, I would say in general terms, have found it more difficult to settle back into school and to finding life, some of them really quite challenging. So quite a lot of demand on our SEMH provisions at the moment, and we are trying to support them more, and higher rates of referrals to the primary behaviour service, but overall that service is coping really well. Thanks, Eric. And then just finally from me, just to update you, we've got the Wellbeing for Education Return and Recovery funding, which has come in from government. We've got some additional funding there for Hampshire. In total, we've got just over £200,000, which we are working with health colleagues in particular to determine how that will be spent, but we're particularly looking at having some additional resources for the relationships, health and sex education curriculum, some more resources and training to support good mental health in schools, and making sure in particular that our children and young people have access to mental health support at the early intervention and prevention stage, so enhancing some of the resources already available there. There's the LINK programme, which is a programme through health colleagues focusing on mental health and strengthening the knowledge and experience and resource in schools in order to support our children and young people with good well-being and mental health. And we're also looking at using some of that funding to support us through the third sector. We've got various alternative provisions that we use currently, and we're seeing if we can access some extra support from them too. Eric's already talked about transition, so you know, there are different ways in which we can make sure that youngsters have good transition experiences as they move from one school to another, or from one teacher to another. So lots happening there, and again we've put some additional resource into that. And then finally from me, and again Eric's really talked about this, I think the key thing for us in terms of vulnerable children and young people is about making sure we respond to the individual, and we understand their lived experience, what's happening for them in their lives now, what's happened over lockdown, and we move on and move them forward based on where they are at the moment, both academically, as Eric has said, and in terms of their well-being and mental health. And it goes back to that variability. Some youngsters are needing a lot more support, and some youngsters not so. So it's about schools really understanding and knowing the needs of their children and young people, which they do, and responding to their experiences in the moment. Okay, that's all from me, and we're going to David next, I think. Yes.
No, thank you. I'm just very conscious of time, so I'm going to move through these really kind of quickly, and hopefully we'll have a chance for kind of discussion in a moment. The thing I would desperately underline is that there is no sort of pattern across Hampshire, very much like primary and kind of special schools. Every school is kind of facing its own kind of specific circumstances in terms of the return to school. So can we have the next slide, please? So for example, some schools are kind of reporting to me and saying that pupils have kind of come back and are just pleased to be back and are just getting on with it, and you know, that's fine. But we're anticipating, David, that something may well kind of bubble up some way down the line, so we've got our kind of pastoral teams on kind of, you know, ready to receive that. Other schools are talking about some of the challenges that they're having around kind of socialisation, around you know, small numbers of children who when they kind of get into arguments, they kind of escalate very kind of quickly. Other schools are talking about some kind of small numbers of children exhibiting very challenging behaviour, which links back to things that have happened kind of over lockdown, and the way in which they've been engaging kind of broader partners around kind of meeting that challenge. So some other schools are saying we actually want to increase the amount of PE in kids' diet over the remainder of the summer term, because they just haven't been kind of exercising. And other schools have been talking to me about this kind of a particular year 11 thing around a small number of pupils who, because through year 10 and year 11 they've had so much time out of school, they kind of got into this mindset of what's the point, and have been kind of working and supporting those children to really think about the kind of future, the sort of courses they might want to study post 16 to kind of re-engage them. If I could have the next slide. The two bits I would underline that schools are kind of busily engaged in is the whole thing about so let's look at what we're offering through the rest of the summer term in terms of our curriculum, and really let's see if we need to fine tune that to any of the needs that we're seeing children have got, and I know heads have put a lot of thought into that, and particularly through into next year in terms of kind of, you know, identifying any gaps that children might have had in their knowledge and building that into the curriculum for next year. And the other bit that I think marks secondary schools out compared to other schools is the considerable, and you know, I'd underline that 3 times in red, amount of time, effort, work that schools have had to put into coming up with a robust process to draw out GCSE and A-level grades, which people are having to do basically on top of normal teaching. That has been a real kind of significant challenge with the kind of return of children to secondary schools. So sorry, I've rattled through those, but I'll shut up now and hand back over.
Thank you, David. Thank you, Karen, and thank you, Eric, for that really interesting presentation about how our schools are coping and how our young people are doing. Does anyone have any questions that they would like to ask? Jackie Porter, would you like to ask your question?
Thank you. And I suppose it was sort of covered, but in David's presentation, but the reintegration of the whole class, the children, it's been reported to me from some local primary schools that the children that were in all the time have come back and are lauding it, frankly, and the ones who haven't been there for a long time feel a little bit more concerned about it and I find it difficult to break back in, and some primary schools have commented on that, particularly for reception in year 1, where those children haven't really been there to experience it. And I wondered if that's happened at all levels of schooling. That's the first question. And the second one is, we haven't talked about young carers, and certainly my mailbag was full of people who were concerned about their own health and putting children back into school. And I wondered if you've got any comment about those 2 points.
I'm happy to pick up on your bit about kind of the reintroduction of other years, and certainly you know, heads have reported to me about the vulnerable people, the vulnerable pupils who have been kind of attending schools all through kind of lockdown. They have reported to me, you know, stories about how those children, you know, a number of them have really kind of flourished and have really grown through through that time. I think, you know, heads broadly have been saying to me, yeah, you know, some of those have been a bit put out that the rest of the children are now coming back to school because, you know, they've been receiving such a kind of focused and personalised diet. But schools are kind of keen to build on that relationship that they now have with that group of children, kind of forever now. But in terms of the return, I think, you know, the heads I've talked to about this have said, you know, some children, particularly in sort of year 7, who maybe haven't had an experience of the school over time, it's because they've had quite a disruptive first year in secondary school. So some of the year 7 children have been a little bit anxious about the return, but generally, you know, the picture across Hampshire, as kind of reported back to me by heads, is that pupils have been really glad to have a bit of normality back in their lives and have responded really well to just kind of coming back and getting on with something in a way that they haven't been able to do for kind of 8, 9, 10 weeks. In terms of the bit about young carers, I know there were, through the lockdown periods, some kind of anxieties around children where you had parents who were kind of extremely clinically vulnerable, and I know we kind of got into conversations with the DfE to sort of be clear with them about the pressures on young carers and you know, some high levels of anxiety for these children about, if I come into school, am I going to catch something that I then take back to my parents? And I know we were working kind of actively with a number of schools around kind of specific individual cases to support those children.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Jackie and David. Next, I've got Councillor Jackie Branson, who has a question.
It's also a question and comments. I think in the Havant area, we obviously have a lot of children that don't come from the best of backgrounds. And in the school that I'm involved with, we reckon that sort of up to 50% of the children have come back with a certain level of anxiety. And I just really wondered whether you feel that the government's help to catch up is really going to help the mass of children that we have in, you know, areas such as ours. You know, their sort of suggestion was, you know, let's lengthen the school day. But when you've got these children that are really in, you know, some mental sort of anxiety, lengthening the school day isn't going to solve the problems. You know, and I just really wondered how much we're sort of rethinking how we can deal with these children. I think, you know, there are many children in the area that the local head said live precarious lives, which I thought was a rather interesting comment. And you know, that looking at the holistic view of education, and in the past we're so keen on the league tables and we must do this, we must do that. I just wondered if you think there might be a rethink on what really is important on education, and, you know, are league tables the be all and end all?
Do you mind if I come in?
Yes,
go for it.
The messages you've just gave, Jackie, is really been a key message that I've given every single week, because I have the joy of meeting with the Department for Education on a weekly basis to feedback messages. And I just wish with kind of government initiatives that what they would do is trust schools, and rather than allying new money to specific individual causes like one-to-one tuition or talking
Absolutely.
about lengthening the school day, I think the better response would be to push that money down towards schools, because they know their children best. And as all the presenters have said to you this morning, the challenges are really different in different schools with different children. Therefore, you know, head teachers and their staff are the best people to put those resources in the right place. And yeah, I couldn't agree with you more about league tables, particularly around English and maths. And that's not me going soft on English and maths. Those are still important. But actually key skills through lockdown, things like PE, things like big art projects, design technology projects, they were things that were really difficult to do on remote learning. And the key one for me, primary, which I think is an essential skill, is learning to swim. You know, you can try it remotely with an ironing board and a couple of flippers, but it doesn't really work in the same way as getting in a swimming pool.
No, thank you for that.
Thank you, Brian and Jackie. Next on the list is Councillor Pankhurst. You have a question that you'd like to ask.
Thank you, Chairman. Just a couple of questions, actually. I mean, thank you very much for the information. It's really useful. The way that you're describing education levels and the anxiety levels in Hampshire is different to what the news reporters are saying. You know, they're talking about summer schools. You know, that vast amounts of levels of education's been lost over the lockdown. And I just wanted to know what your views were on the national side. You know, they're reporting this, you know, right the way around the country. And I do have another question, but if I have some answers for that one first, because they're not linked.
Well, the response for the first bit is the national media has annoyed me around the coverage of this all the time. If you are a child in school and all you hear every time you parents have got the telly on is that you are behind and you need to catch up and that you're feeling anxious and that you're not coping with lockdown, that starts to breed insecurity amongst young people. And the reality is, as Eric has described, if you're a year one child, you've lived the first 2 years of your life in school under these kind of conditions, so don't know any different. And some of the media coverage has, I think, been really disappointing. In terms of the balance of this, most of the head teachers I'm speaking to think that over time they can do the academic catch up, you know, but because the curriculum is a spiral curriculum, you come back to things, they are more bothered about the way that the culture has reset in schools with the behaviours for learning and some of the anxiety issues. And those are the aspects that the most head teachers are reporting to us that they really want to work on in the next period of time.
Thank you. And just one other question. I work at NHS 111 at night, and it's quite disturbing now. We're getting calls from ages 7+, suicidal, self-harming, CAMS, wait times. I mean, are the schools able to actually try and support these children? It's just very concerning, and there's a lot of people in Hampshire that this is happening to.
Karen might want to comment on this, but yes, you are right. And I think it's been a key thing that we've said in the presentations. The pandemic has affected different children differently. And in amongst the generalities, of course, there are a small number of children who have been very adversely affected that may well have had death of close family members because of COVID and have gone through quite traumatic experiences. There is a lot of support out there in terms of mental health. So do you want to go through the main bits of that, Karen?
Thank you.
Thanks, Brian. Yeah, we're working really closely with health services around this, and interestingly, I think what a number of schools are saying is there's actually a lot out there in terms of mental health support, but it's navigating that and finding the right thing for that particular child at the right time. So recent launch of the Couth app, for example, which is there to support youngsters from 11 right through to 25, and many youngsters reporting to us that actually the sort of help they're looking for is help that isn't face-to-face. It is online, is somebody to talk to who might be at the end of the phone, but they don't need to go to an appointment or talk to a real person. That's what adolescents are saying they particularly would like more support with in terms of that form of support. So I do think there are a number of services out there, but it's making sure that schools know where to signpost youngsters to, and youngsters themselves also know where to go for help. So one of the things we're looking to use the Wellbeing for Education Return funding on is what we're calling a one-stop shop that very clearly signposts youngsters and their families who both at an early intervention level, but also when they get to crisis point, that there's a range of places they can go to find the support they need, be that online, over the telephone, or face to face. So, but yeah, I would say that there's certainly an increased awareness of the volume of youngsters who are experiencing anxiety, and certainly we've been working with a number of specific schools where we have youngsters who they feel have reached crisis point, and we've stepped in and helped in terms of finding that multi-agency support that they need where we can.
Thank you. That's very reassuring. Thank you.
Thank you all of you for answering those questions, and thank you for your question, Councillor Pankhurst. Next on my list is Councillor Henderson. Would you like to ask your question?
Thank you, Chair. Karen, my question was very much directed at you, and thank you very much for your presentation. It was about the 40% of vulnerable children who weren't in school. And I suppose my concern is teachers are incredibly well trained and vigilant when it comes to noticing things about children, anything that's amiss. Was there a way of monitoring the welfare of these children? Were there any particular programmes that were put in place to check on their welfare?
Yes, very early on in first lockdown, within the first 2 weeks, I think, we introduced a system jointly with social care, whereby any youngster who was open to social care was identified, and we asked schools to do a weekly return for us. So on a weekly basis, schools told us which children were in attendance and which were not in terms of that vulnerable group, and the actions they'd taken over the course of that week to keep in touch with the family. So schools would, list the sort of contact that they'd had with families, and then members of the school improvement team would have a conversation with the schools, usually once a week, once a fortnight, just to go through that list and to talk to schools in relation to, the sorts of things they were doing for welfare support, for keeping in touch with the families. So there was a remote eye on those children in terms of welfare, as well as lots of the online learning, etc., meant that we had increased contact with both child and family. So that was a really good and robust system that we had in place, which meant that anyone open to social care did absolutely have at least one, if not more, contact from school on a weekly basis. And of course, lots of schools were also doing things like delivering food parcels and keeping in contact in person, actually knocking on doors and having conversations in gardens and so on. Yeah.
Yeah, so social workers were also dealing it from the other end. So they were getting the information from schools, and where families had not been sending their children into school, the social workers were then making contact with those families to do some work with the families to try and encourage them into school. It's why in Hampshire, I think at times we were having 10, 15 and some weeks 20% more vulnerable children in than was the national average. The DFE kept ringing me to saying, what on earth are you doing in Hampshire? Because it's not like this across the rest of the country. So heads responded really well around that agenda for getting children in.
Thank you. That's really reassuring. Thank you.
Thank you. And last but not least, the last question is from Georgina.
Chair, mine wasn't a question, it was just to build on something that David said, inviting a school view, and to link to Councillor Porter's comment, if I may. I just wanted to add, Councillor Porter, you mentioned about pupils returning and then perhaps feeling unsettled, and to sort of share some perhaps best practice was learning that was taken from the lockdown one, because we saw that, we recognised, lots of schools recognised that children who weren't in felt that they were missing out, even though provision was being made available for children at home. So I think a real game changer for some settings was taking that learning and then moving pretty much the whole school online. And therefore that enabled a reduction in numbers on site. Obviously, we've already heard about the importance of certain groups of children being represented and being given an opportunity to do that on site. But by moving a whole school provision online and making live teaching available, assemblies available, interventions available, one-to-ones, group meets, etc., and giving that same offer to children regardless of whether they were on site or whether they were at home, made a really massive difference. And I think this time around, the schools who were able to implement that felt that when then children returned, everybody had had the same. So not only was that really useful for children's sense of identity, keeping in touch and equity of offer, it was also a real game changer for parents, particularly working parents. So it's perhaps a bit of a misnomer that some schools are saying that they were asking schools to be home taught. Lots of schools are asking parents to facilitate that home learning. And of course, there had to be an absolutely massive push on technology in order to make sure that families could do that. And that was quite a challenge, I think, for some families if there were one or more children in the household, or if the adult needed the tech as well to do their job. So there's been some really good practice in order for IT to get into the home, be actually in hardware or actually connection to the internet. And we saw a real difference. I think that's been profiled by some settings using Impact Ed, which was actually able to profile children about how they were feeling and about the impact of lockdown on them. And that's a national research project. And I think schools who participated in that actually found that it was often many families who were actually money rich but time poor. It was actually often those children who were having troubles because they were identifying that they weren't perhaps having the attention that some of our families were, who perhaps did have more capacity to support, engage in learning, which is a really positive outlook for some of our families. And that's been evidenced really clearly in that national project. And what I also wanted to add, as the councillors have outlined, there's been a different picture for sort of different circumstances, school leaders having to respond to an array of circumstance. I think it's really important that learning is taken from the last year, and there has been some real positives. And I recognise that schools are going to continue to do things that they wouldn't have done pre-COVID, because they've recognised it's impacted really positively on a community or school routines. And I think that key thing is actually the use of tech. I think that settings that are looking at different hybrid learning models will then really wrap around some of the vulnerable pupils that have been referenced here and make learning accessible in a variety of ways that previously we hadn't been successful in. And I think it's really important that schools and the county focus on clear case studies so that we can embrace successes and build on those so that that learning isn't lost. So I hope that addresses some of what you were saying about making sure that those children are best represented, because I think there is some really valuable learning from lockdown 1 that then supported lockdown 2 and then that return. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you for that, Georgina. Justin, do you want to add?
Thank you. Yeah, just a comment regarding Karen's presentation, just to echo what she was saying, but I think not to underestimate the vaccination programme in terms of well-being of staff in special schools was absolutely fantastic. I'll never forget the day we had the phone call back in January and telling staff that they were being prioritised for vaccination. The difference that made to well-being and morale for all the staff was wonderful. I know I've said it to Karen and Brian before, but I think so councillors are aware that the difference it made in my school and across Hampshire special schools, shouldn't be underestimated. And I would always thank colleagues again for all the hard work behind the scenes to make that work. It made a massive, massive difference. So thank you again.
Thank you for that, Justin. It was, amazing, and the response that we had from that was really, really positive. And just thank you for that comment. It's really nice to know that it was well received. Okay, does anyone else have any questions or comments that they would like to make on this last item? Councillor Porter, do you want to?
My last one really is we've not mentioned music. We've talked about physical activity, and obviously music has been really challenging in this last year, and also money. Certainly most of the 4-year-olds I know now have never seen money in their lived experience, and I wondered if there are specific areas where I see Georgina's put her hand up, specific areas where it'd be really interesting to see what changes. And the other really positive was parents' evenings. Of course, online parents' evenings, certainly the school I was at, the attendance was far higher than we'd ever get at a normal parents' evening.
David, do you want to comment on any of that, and Brian?
Yeah.
Go on, David. You go.
Eric was going to talk about money and 4-year-olds, but no, you're right, as Brian kind of mentioned, it is some of those more practical activities that you know, kids have missed out on, and certainly in secondary schools, I kind of, I know I had to skim through what I talked about, but it is precisely those sorts of things that certainly secondary heads are really looking at through the experiences children have through the summer term, and that whole bit about really looking at and getting our curriculum right for the kids through the summer term to try and address some of those experiences that they've missed out on. Brian, did you want to come in on that?
Only to say, Jackie, would make for an interesting agenda item for the music service to talk about how they kept music going throughout lockdown, because there was some absolute stunning practice online, and you know, I was being sent clips where they were doing things with hundreds of kids all in unison through Teams, which was some of the most stunning quality. There was some great work that actually went on around music. Not quite the same as sitting all together and making music, doing it online, but they did the best in the circumstances.
Okay.
Thank you. And I can guarantee, Jackie, that 4-year-olds may not have known what money looks like, but they can certainly spend.
Yeah, definitely.
They're fine there. Georgina, are you?
Yes, just jumping in there, Councillor Porter, I concur with what Brian was just saying. There was some really fabulous provision offered to schools from Hampshire Music Service throughout lockdown, and options were provided for schools to buy into, which meant obviously not only could there be whole school lessons taking place, but it meant that the peripatetic lessons could continue as well, and that was offered in a variety of ways. And then when schools did reopen fully as well, there was a real keenness for the music service to continue working in schools. I think that has been really positive, that element of the arts can continue. I think particularly for primary settings, that's quite a specialist area, so to have that support continuing was really valued. So I concur. I just wanted to offer that as a in-school perspective.
Thank you, Georgina. Okay, well, thank you for that really amazing presentation, David, Karen and Eric. And I think we've all found it really interesting to know what's been happening and what we're doing going forward as well. And thank you, Georgina, for adding the insight for what's been going on in schools, and Justin as well. That moves me nicely on to the last item on the agenda for today, which is elective home education. And this is another presentation from Brian and Dave Harvey. Hand over to you, Brian.
Yes, again, I'm not going to spend hours introducing it because I want the presentations to be quite short so we can kind of get into the discussion. So I'll pass over to Dave. But I knew this would be an item that members would want to discuss, the impact on elective home education of the pandemic. So I'll let David go through his slides and then we can get into some discussion afterwards.
Okay, well, good morning, everybody. I'm just about to put the slides up. So let me know if you can see that. Okay.
We can see that.
Okay, great, thank you. I thought I'd try to be as quick as I can, and I'll try and whiz through the slides, and so you've got a chance to ask questions. But I think it's worth repeating one or two things. One is that education is compulsory, the school isn't, and parents have every right to electively home educate. And I think Hampshire's position has always been to respect that. I thought you might like to see something about the growth in numbers. Some people equate growth in numbers with being a problem. I don't necessarily think it's a problem necessarily for individual children, although it may be, but there are significant issues. As of today, there's approximately 2,000, actually about 2,087 now, children who are electively home educated in Hampshire. That's about 1.2% of the total school population. And as you can see from that table, that's grown considerably in the last 5-6 years. And I can talk later on about the impact of COVID as well, but that growth is steady and continuing. Still lots of issues around the law and elective home education. The notion of what is suitable education is still a big issue, and it's not really clearly defined. Equipping a child, for life in the community of which they're going to be a member is incredibly loose. But nevertheless, the LA has the duty to decide whether the education is suitable or not the parent. Moving on. Most children who are electively home educated come out of school, and we know about all of those. The only ones we don't necessarily know about are those children who've never been to school, because there's no duty on the parents to tell anybody that is the case. We have probably about 150 of those children that we know of because the parents voluntarily tell us. But I don't know what I don't know. If a child is in school, the law is very clear that the parent is recommended to tell the school and put that in writing. They don't have to. However, if they don't, it means I treat the children as a child missing education because they just don't turn up at school. So it's in their interest to tell the school, and the school has a simple duty to tell the local authority. At that point, the school must take the child off the school roll as well. We do encourage all our schools, and we give extensive guidance to discuss with parents when they know that they're thinking about electively home educating, so that at least the parent knows what they're letting themselves in for. Quite often parents don't understand what they're letting themselves in for. That is a problem. Once we know about it, then everything swings into action, and we write and so forth. I thought you might like to see the rapid increase, effectively, the COVID impact. Numbers, increased significantly, as you can see there. 1,024. That was up 78%. We wait to see whether all those children are returning to school. Some are, some aren't. Again, that's just illustrated in a different way, but showing in September we had nearly 500 children come out. We were actually overwhelmed at that time. We couldn't respond quick enough, and so forth, as you imagine. But I've been very grateful. We've increased our staffing and so forth, and we're getting on top of this. What's interesting about this graph is that the majority of children who came out for COVID shifted the primary-secondary balance. Historically, most children are at Key Stage 4 who are electively home educated. That begs a load of questions in itself as to why anybody would pull their child out in year 10. But nevertheless, what happened during COVID was, generally speaking, more primary age children came out. So the graph has a different pattern in 2020-21 than in any previous year. So it's a more levelling out process. Very quickly, we have a team, and that's what we do. The team's grown significantly, and we have a coordinator. We have nearly 4 home visitors now with associated admin behind it, because each case takes an awful lot of time to investigate and to talk to parents. Any single contact with a parent can be half an hour on the phone supporting them, so it's quite labour intensive. We prioritise children, so those we RAG rate them. That means those children who are known to CIS, those known to social services, or have an EHCP, or have an exclusion history, or quite frankly, the head teacher says, look, I'm really concerned this child should never be home educated in 1,000 years, then we will prioritise them. We have an extensive website, and we still offer to pay for year 10 and 11 examinations. Very few local authorities do that. I think that's really important that we continue to do that, because what it does is it gives EHE parents confidence to engage with us, and naturally it helps our reputation. We continue to have really good links with some quite local education groups, home education groups. We liaise frequently with the NHS, social care, all responding to the individual child. So there's a lot going on. Interestingly, which schools do they come out of is really interesting. The graph speaks for itself, but what it is worth noting is that proportionately the number of children coming out of academies was over double the rate for community schools. We do challenge schools, and I speak to all head teachers about this this matter, when we think that perhaps school have encouraged the child to come out. The guidance was updated in 2019, national guidance. It's a huge improvement on the 2007 guidance, which quite frankly wasn't fit for purpose. I'm pleased to say that I'm in regular contact with the DfE. I meet with them fortnightly, partly in my role as Hampshire, but also in my other roles with the Association of Elective Home Education Professionals, which is an LA group. They're looking at reviewing the guidance 2019 already to strengthen it in places. But basically, the guidance talks about proportionality and allowing local authorities to focus on those children who are most at risk, which is what Hampshire does. Critically, it reminds us and gives clear guidance. It is for the LA to judge whether the education is suitable. We must have oversight of all children and make contact at least annually with all families. All those things are a challenge, but nevertheless, it also firms up what we can do if a parent doesn't cooperate. So essentially, if a parent refuses to cooperate, won't allow access, won't tell us what they're doing, we can make the decision that therefore the education is not suitable. And that's quite important because some EHE lobby groups are very keen that the LAs don't actually follow that route. Okay, so it's our duty to find out. We must make arrangements to do that. That can be quite difficult. It's been challenging over COVID, obviously, because home visits have been limited. Although, ironically, many home education parents are happier to have a Teams meeting because it's not quite so invasive at their home. I think a lot of parents are worried that LA officers will be going judging the wallpaper and so forth. So that's been something which we've learned and we will incorporate going forward. Perhaps first contacts by Teams meetings is a good way forward. Lots of implications for the new guidance. And Hampshire is well placed, in my view. The big issue is around the suitability of education and how we assess that. And I'm pushing hard, as is the number of organisations, for greater clarity from the DfE about suitability. The DfE are reluctant, but we're pushing them hard. I'll move on from that because I think we've discussed, the law and guidance is still crazy because it still talks about parents are under no duty to respond. And some parents just read those first 5-6 words and don't, and that makes it very difficult. Lots of children leave EHE. One of the things that we may have 2,085 children who are elective home educated, that hides a great deal of turbulence. Children coming into school, going back out of school. So the actual numbers is considerably higher, nearer 2,500 children who've been in education at some home education at some point. And this table just illustrates that turbulence which is going on all the time. Obviously, a major interface with safeguarding. If the parents aren't providing a suitable education, that is a form of harm. And that's a route which LAs are in Hampshire increasingly taking. So it's a safeguarding issue. To give you some idea of impact, one of the things that we've really worked hard on the last 2 years is to increase engagement, which was, 5 years ago was less than 20% of parents engaged with us. Number of home visits has increased dramatically feedback forms from parents. We try to make the feedback form as easy as possible. Telephone calls, and this is just 520 there, is simply the extended telephone calls. Highest contact, because during the COVID, we utilised highest staff to contact parents who we haven't spoken to for a long time. And engagement 50 to 54%, which is a huge increase. Still a long way to go. 40% was last year. We're hoping to hit at least 60% this year of engagement with parents. I thought you might be interested in where the home educators are. I could talk extensively about why there's 1.6% in East Hampshire and only 0.8% in Hart, a whole combination of factors, but it is interesting that you can see your own district. Those figures are fairly consistent, but there is some variation within them. Some of the big issues. 4% of Hampshire children are known to social care. One of the things that I've asked the DfE is, should we allow children who are on a CP plan to be elected to be home educated, for instance? I think that's an interesting question. In 2019, the DfE issued a massive consultation. They still haven't released the outcomes. You can speculate why. What they are saying is that it's pretty clear for all the channels I work with that compulsory registration is going to come. I think that's a good thing. Hampshire supported that strongly. Of great interest is Portsmouth County Council. You may have heard, have got a tribunal outcome, which will be critical. And basically, that is where an EHE lobby group has challenged the local authority, Portsmouth, over the evidence, whether it's suitable or not. And the problem is that what parents will do, they'll just go onto the internet, download a load of resources and just say that that's what they're doing. And Portsmouth are pushing back on that and saying, no, that's not evidence. And the Education Otherwise, which is the lobby group, have taken them to tribunal over that. And it really will be critical, the outcome of that. As I said, no clear guidance on suitable education. Big issues around examination centres for EHE. EHE children suffered disproportionately last year because they couldn't get grades for obvious reasons, really, because parents can't predict the grade very accurately, or shouldn't do. And there's also an issue over examination centres, because what's happened in COVID is that schools are very reluctant to take extra children on for good reasons. And the other huge issue is that LAs are underfunded by the DfE. So we could do so much more if we had more. And I just mentioned finally defining the oversight, which is basically what the tribunal is about. Okay, that's me done in terms of the presentation. I'll take it down.
Thank you, Daniel. Does anyone have any questions or comments they'd like to ask or make? Councillor Jackie Porter.
Thank you. One thing that does come into my inbox quite a lot is parents whose own children, they don't feel their provision is being made by the county council at the right time in the right place for the right sort of provision. So as a governor, I know many of my fellow governors have actually chosen to home educate for a period of time. And Dave talked about parents putting children, some children are going in and out of the home education process. Do we know what proportion of that total is parents where they are waiting effectively for a problem to be resolved rather than a decision of electing for home education as a permanent decision? I had two even this morning of parents who basically can't get into a school that's right next door to them, so they're choosing not to send their child, or a child who's got special needs whose school hasn't been decided yet.
To answer that question, the answer is we have some knowledge, but parents aren't obliged to tell the local authority why they are electively home educating. So quite often the reasons they give aren't necessarily the actual reasons, if that makes sense. I'm aware of some children, I do have statistics which tell me because they can't get the school place that they want, which is very, very tiny. The SEN issue is more common. What tends to happen is a child is being assessed for an EHCP. They're waiting for the educational healthcare plan to come out, and in the meantime, the parents decide that the school is not able to meet their child's needs and withdraw them. Sometimes the school would disagree strongly. They say, no, we can meet need, and we are meeting need. And the parents still don't think they are. So getting firm statistics on that sort of thing, Jackie, is really quite hard.
It's certainly the one that dominates my inbox on education, I'd say.
Interesting.
Thank you, Councillor Thornton. Thank you, Dave, for responding. Councillor Juliet Henderson.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you very much, Dave, for your presentation. I've got two very short questions, really, and the first is, do we have any data on the outcomes for these children who are home educated, academically or otherwise? And from what I gather, is it important that certain aspects of the Children's Act are actually tightened up to give clearer definitions?
Okay.
Can I jump in on that one, David? It's a great question, and it's one that frustrates Dave and myself. And Dave and myself meet with the DFE regularly to talk about this. Dave leads the National Educational Professional Group for EHE, and I chair the Children Missing Education group across the South East 19 set of authorities. So we get to meet with the DFE really regularly. But to answer your point about outcomes, again, this is one Councillor Chad raised with me recently as well. There is no data at the moment because there is no register of the children that are electively home educated. But however, if the government do publish, say to parents, you have to register with the local authority, that would give us the unique pupil number for every child that's EHE across the country. And it would then be possible to pull together statistics like what proportion of those pupils end up neat, what proportion don't then end up in employment at the age of 19, what proportion actually get English and maths at grade 5 as a result of elective home education. And I think those are really key stats that would be useful for the local authority to have, so that when a parent's debating whether to become an electively home educated parent, that they've got some statistics as to what the outcomes are around that. At the moment, we're still lobbying really hard with government to say to them, you need to make mandatory registration a reality. All the information we're getting is we're not far off that now, and that is coming down the track, but we need that before we can do the other bits, really. I don't, Dave, if you want to jump in and say something.
No, I agree with you entirely, Brian. I mean, one of the interesting things is that some EHE children do sit GCSEs, but we don't know the outcomes at all, because the exam board treat them as private candidates and don't distinguish between, somebody who's in their retirement taking a GCSE and a child. And if the government wanted to, as Brian says, that could be sorted. I've mentioned the lobby groups, and the lobby groups don't want registration at all. And I suspect part of the reason is because whilst many elective home education parents do really truly educate their children, high quality stuff probably. I say probably because we don't really know, but let's assume that they do. We suspect that there are a huge number who don't, and if the statistics were released, it will probably show that the vast majority of those children in year 11 don't take any examinations whatsoever, so there are no outcomes, and the lobby groups wouldn't want that to come out, hence why they find that one. The second part of your question was about whether the government need to alter the Children's Act. Probably they do, but there's no appetite in government that I can see to change the law on elective home education. Up until now, they've been happy to change the guidance of the law. As it happens, I'm meeting with Baroness Berridge next week to discuss this, a number of matters of concern. And one of the things that I would be pushing her for is, can we look at changing the law? Lord Soley, I worked with last year, got really close, but it didn't actually materialise. And there's some aspects of the law, I think it would be helpful if it was changed.
Thank you, that's really helpful. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dave and Councillor Henderson. Next I have Councillor Jackie Branson.
Thank you, Chairman. I just wondered if, as councillors, we should be in a position, we should report areas of concern, having met a mother who was self-educated, who was elected to home educating a child who was in year 1, I think, and she also had a younger child. I think she's a member of these lobby groups, and she's very, very anti registration. But I would have been very concerned that the education probably wasn't up to standard by what I saw. I just wondered whether I ought to report that to you, or whether it's her choice and therefore it's not up to me to make that judgment.
It's always worth you letting me know, Jackie. If they come through to me, we'll put them through the DCS admin route so that Dave can be given the information and can respond properly back to you.
Okay, I will do that. Thank you.
We do get the number of members of the public will contact us to say, little Johnny's on the street all day long and so forth, and he's home educated, and we do follow those up.
Thank you. Thank you for that.
Thank you. And then next is Councillor Sarah Pankhurst.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. Going on from secondary education, how do the home educated students get to further education, and what problems are there? And do you know outcomes after further education for these students? Thank you.
Okay, well, first of all, we offer careers guidance as part of our offer. Parents can take that up. So that's the first thing. Second thing is elective home education is only from 5 to 16. Once you are past the age of 16, there is no elective home education as such. Anecdotally, a lot of elective home educated children do go into college at 16 to 18, and we know of some who go on to university, and there are many people in public life who've been electively home educated, but the local authority has no duty for those children who are 17, so I don't know about them, if that makes sense. So every June, X number of year 11s come off the EHE roll.
Thank you. And finally, Councillor Jackie Porter with another question.
Actually, it's just a statement. I think I probably ought to recognise, I haven't got, it's a family interest. My son actually works for Pearson's, who provides home education courses, and is actually developing a new set of online courses for home educators. I think I ought to say this at this point. They do it for America, but currently introducing it into the UK. So I just need to say that, I think.
Thank you. I'm sure Louise will note that for us. Does anyone else have any questions or comments that they would like to make? Ian?
Yeah, I just prompted there by what Councillor Porter just said. I do think we're going to have a shift in the landscape. And we come out of the pandemic with the world trying to work out a blended approach to life at work, a blended approach to existence. Look at us now. etc. And I think that therefore will lead to a bit of a reimagining of how things will be, and schooling will be part of that reimagining. And I think probably we need to sort of perhaps shift our thinking from the binary of you're educated at school or you're educated at home. And because actually I think many people will start to adopt the commercial practices that are coming into the field. And I think that's going to be the greater concern. No disrespect to your relative, Councillor Porter, but when people are seeing profit-making opportunities to be taking advantage of online provision, what is going to be our quality assurance of that? And I actually think there's a really good opportunity for schools and the local authority and all of us in the schooling landscape to be talking together about how we might move from what was the previous paradigm to a new paradigm in which quality of provision and care and safeguarding is the main topic of conversation, not, oh, well, it's just inevitable that the best place for them to be all the time is in school. So I would really encourage this advisory group to grapple with what I think could be a bit of a turning point in the way in which we organise our lives.
Thank you for that comment, Ian. Does anyone else have anything that they would like to add at this point? Brian?
I think it would be really remiss of me if I didn't just say a couple of bits at the end of this, Councillor Chad, and I think you'll probably want to say something as well. This is likely to be Dave's last meeting with us. Dave retires at the end of September. Huge, great loss to the County Council. He has been an absolute stalwart around the exclusion agenda. If our schools excluded at the same rate as the national rate, we'd have 200 permanent exclusions a year. We don't. We have between 70 and 80, and much of that, I think, is due to the fantastic relationship Dave has built up with schools over a number of years, and they feel they can go to him for advice as to what else is available, and also the contribution he's made around elective home education. And the elective home education department in the DFE is part of private education, and just to show the importance to which the DFE assigned to elective home education, I'll let you know that they've only got one member of staff for the whole country. That member of staff is currently being inducted by Dave, in effect, because he's meeting regularly so that he understands the kind of challenges that are going on. So we've got a new person called Jonathan Wilcox, who's currently a pastoral deputy of a secondary school in Bournemouth, that's joined us to take up that post. But Dave will leave us at the end of September. Jonathan's joining at the 1st of September, so there'll be a transition there. The other person that will be leaving us at the end of this year, sorry David, because I know you don't want any embarrassment in a public place and don't want me to say any nice words at all, so I won't say a great deal, but David is also very, very old now and needs to retire. We often do a wham thing between the two of us, and it feels like Andrew Ridgely's now going off to Cornwall with his surfboard. You know, again, on a whole range of fronts, I'm going to miss David from his public contribution that he's made, both as a science inspector, a school improvement manager, an area director, and currently the lead for secondary and post-16 education. But on a personal basis, David challenges my thinking incredibly regularly and makes sure that the educational approach we've had in Hampshire has been very values-led, because he holds the right values really, really close. So, you know, losing David as well. Natalie Smith, we had a national recruitment campaign around that one, same as Dave's post, and Natalie Smith has been appointed as the new secondary lead as well. So we're in good hands moving forward, but I just wanted to state on the public record, huge thanks to both David and Dave for the contribution they've made in education in Hampshire over the last few years. Thank you.
Thank you both.
Thank you, Brian, for those words. And on a round of applause for you both. You have both have done an amazing job for Hampshire over the years. Dave, I know how highly you are regarded within the elected home education community, and hear lots of feedback from them in how well thought after you are in particular, and that's really reassuring to know for us as members, and just a great achievement. And David, we will miss you greatly too. We really will. Your input in our secondary schools has been amazing, and we've seen those schools just improve endlessly. It's been great, and it's been a real honour to work with you. And on a personal note, the development that things you've helped me achieve personally as well within my role, I really do thank you from the bottom of my heart, both of you. Does anyone on that note have any comments that they would like to make while we've got a few more minutes?
Thank you. Can I just say, I echo your thoughts completely. Both David and Dave have been amazing and offered very personal support as well as political support, and I really do appreciate that in both cases. Both gentlemen's passion for their subject has shone through, absolutely shone through. So really do appreciate both of them, and we're very sad to see them go.
Absolutely. And it's always been children first, which is what we're all here for in these committees, and these two have definitely always shown that. And yeah, it's just amazing. It's been amazing to work with you both, it really has. On that note, we've probably embarrassed you enough, but I don't know if you want to say a few words yourselves.
Just thank you so much for those kind of kind words, and just to scotch any rumours, I'm not off to Cornwall with my surfboard. I'm off to Swindon with my surfboard, so that's going to go well, isn't it? But I've just really kind of treasured my work with kind of everyone in Hampshire over the years, and the school system is fantastic, and heads do a brilliant job in Hampshire, and I think in terms of councillors and a council, I couldn't think of a better one to work for. The support that you also, the support and the interest and the care that you show for schools and for children too is just kind of first rate. It's been great to work with everybody in Hampshire. So thank you.
Yeah, I'd just like to echo David's words and say thank you to everybody for your kind words. I will say that it's been a privilege to work for Hampshire and to work with all the schools and the heads in particular, and develop those relationships, and all the officers. I work for an outstanding county, and I'm really proud of that fact. So I've been 40 years in education, not quite as long as Mr. Hardcastle, but because I'm a lot younger than he is, but nevertheless, I've enjoyed every minute of my career in education. I intend to enjoy it right up to the last day. So thank you for your support. It's much appreciated.
Thank you. And on that note, I will close this meeting and ask for the live broadcast to be stopped.